Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us and for being here with Immigrants Rising as part of this webinar.
We're very excited that you're able to join us for our second webinar happening this year.
Exactly. So we're here for financial aid for undocumented students. Today's webinar, it's going to be all about financial aid. And we're super excited. Rocio and I have been developing this webinar so that we can impact all of you educators that are working with undocumented students on the ground. And I'll start by sharing a little bit about myself. So I'm Estefania Hermosillo. I'm the Community Education Lead at Immigrants Rising. I've been working at Immigrants Rising now for we're going on the 4th year, and I love what we do at Immigrants Rising. When I was a student in college, I used these services and these resources, and it's been really awesome to be working with this organization to then be on the end where I get to inform and see, okay, what kind of information is going to impact educators. So I'm just really excited for this webinar, and I'm happy to be with you all.
Yes, thank you, Stefania. Hi, everyone. My name is Rocio Preciado, and I'm the High School Engagement Manager. And I've been part of Immigrants Rising since 2013. And one of the reasons why I decided to join Immigrants Rising was because I had the opportunity to see the impact that educators and people who are on the ground have on the access and the information that can be shared with undocumented students out on the ground. Part of the work that I've been able to do here through Immigrants Rising has been working alongside educators who, like you all, who are the ones who are directly working with students on a day-to-day basis. I had the opportunity to work with some students in the past through UC Santa Cruz, and I remember hearing a lot of questions that came up when the California Dream Act was just out. There were a lot of questions and a lot of concerns, and we hope that this webinar will give you an opportunity to be able to think of some of those specific scenarios that you might be coming across on your day-to-day basis, that we're able to give you some more information and have you access some of those resources that you can use.
Perfect. And so just as a reminder, this is a webinar that is part of a series. It's a 7-webinar series with key topics that we found are relevant to undocumented students, but more important, well, they're relevant to educators that work with undocumented students. And so you're at the second webinar today. So thank you for joining us. Here are the dates of all of the rest of the webinars that will be coming up. I will be emailing all of this information to everyone who attended and everyone who is has registered for the webinar series. So expect to hear more about how this whole series is going. And it's the first year we do this. We have a goal to reach as many educators across all of California. This isn't a California-focused webinar for now, for this year as we pilot this method. And it's the first time we do it, and we want to, again, expand our reach. We've been really Bay Area, and it's been great. We have some in LA, but what would it take to reach all those northern cities, the Central Valley, like these places where they don't have access to us in person? And we want to reach those educators that reach those students. And so this series is intended to, again, use the method of technology to take us where we haven't been. And we can't travel because traveling in person sometimes doesn't work.
And to add to that, it's also, as you can see, some of those topics really focus on the holistic support for undocumented students. Yes, this webinar will be tailored on college and financial aid, but it's very important to also keep in mind some of the holistic support that needs to take in place in order to actually get students to complete financial aid applications and to be able to access the aid that is available to them. So we encourage you to continue to stay tuned to all of the other topics that are as relevant as the conversation of financial aid.
And we also are giving an UndocuAlly certificate to those who attend at least 5 of the 7 webinars and then complete the evaluations for the webinars that you attend. So along with this, with the email that I send with the webinar details, I'll send a follow-up evaluation. And by completing the evaluation, you've said, yes, I've attended and I have feedback to give, and we would give you an UndocuAlly certificate. And obviously, the most important, you got to be committed to providing support for undocumented students, which we find you are. just by even being here today. So that's a reminder that we will be doing that as well. Now, for what we're here today, so we're here to increase the ability of undocumented students to receive all state-based financial aid for which they are eligible for. There are common pitfalls, there are common roadblocks that students face in the process of receiving all the aid that they're eligible for. And so today we're going to be addressing some of those, and we're going to be giving you not just the information, but then what actions you can take to be able to impact the students. And we had a report that was published recently. It's the California Community Colleges Dreamers Project report and strengthening institutional practices to support undocumented student success. Immigrants Rising was a partner in having that report published. And you can see here that financial aid was the most pressing need for undocumented students. And now these were college undocumented students and community college undocumented students, 111 participating colleges that participated in this. And that's why this topic is just so important. That's part of it. And we use some of these topics. Actually, our webinar series follows what some of these topics are as well. And then today's, you all asked great questions. You all sent out a lot of questions to us through the registration, and we valued all those questions. I took a lot of those into consideration in designing this series. And some of those questions were things that you wanted to know, like informational based. And some of that was, actionable, how to do something. And as I was designing this webinar, I'll just mention, there was a point where I looked and said, okay, well, some of this stuff, if I did a Google search and I said, how would I find this if I were in your shoes, right? And I saw that the web is filled with a lot of information. And I spoke to my colleague and we had a conversation about why show up to this webinar and what's gonna have this that we give you be distinct from what you would find online. And we saw maybe you want to hear from someone that's reliable, like reassurance, or we have information to give that you just couldn't find when you looked online, or what are the ways that we frame the information that will have you in this webinar get something that you just wouldn't be able to find on Google on a regular search. So the commitment for today is not only to give you information, but also give you actions that you can take that can then, again, lead to you being having a higher level of capacity to impact those students that you're working with every day.
And so for today's presentation, some of that will include giving you some general information regarding financial aid, giving you access to where you can find some of that information. The exciting thing is that we do have some resources that can support you in being able to not just take actions for yourself, but also things that you can share with students that will make some of the steps and some of the most actionable steps accessible for students and visible. And the other thing that we would like to share is to really encourage you to complete the post-evaluation as an actionable step. Why? Because that information really informs how we continue to design and implement additional resources that can continue to support your role as an educator working on the ground.
Yeah. And we'll start by addressing that some of these questions that came in were regarding national policy and students outside of California. Again, for this year, this series is focused with the educators in California in mind. And there is an amazing website, ulead.net, and they actually look to see in every state what are the policies that impact college access for these students. And so if anybody has asked you questions about going outside of California, or for people who are outside of California, keep in mind that the in-state tuition and financial aid requirements vary by state. So all the information I'm going to give after this will be California focused, most of it. There will be some at the end that won't, but most of it will be based on California, and it varies by state. So that website, ulead.net, is really, really great. And we'll be posting that right now in the chat box. Private schools have the most flexibility. So the private schools can provide some funding for undocumented students that is not connected to state or federal funds. And be aware what those requirements are. Definitely pursue scholarships. Students are going to have to pursue scholarships. And then this key piece,
which is making an assessment of students. So some of those costs to be able to go to a university outside of California and other states, one, it will vary based on the type of aid, institutional aid, private aid that is available within the institution. It would also vary based on the student's eligibility when it comes to the requirements in that from that specific state, which, like Estefania mentioned, if you access the organization you lead, you'll be able to see what are the requirements for these specific students to be able to meet the eligibility to access aid in that state. And in order to make a full-on assessment for students who are for sure attending a school outside of California, in order for them to get a scope of what their financial aid package could potentially look like and what can be offered for the students. It's important for this to know that because they might have their own application process for financial aid, specifically in private schools, students get to print out a paper, get to print out the FAFSA application, send that to the school that they're interested in attending in order for private schools to be able to make an assessment of what financial aid package and what kind of aid they can offer their students by making their own calculations. So again, there are certain steps that students have to take if they're interested in going to school outside of California. It's important to understand the policy, and in order for them to have an assessment, it's important that they complete a paper FAFSA application for the school to do their own calculations and being able to offer students some of the requirements.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that, Rocio. So now, what are we talking about when we're talking about financial aid? Well, we have this diagram. I brought it up at the last webinar, but we are talking about undocumented students' eligibility for in-state tuition and financial aid. And then there is many questions came in about undocumented students that do not qualify for an in-state tuition and financial aid, and I'll go into that as well. But we're really talking and focusing on this, the segment of students here, you know, from the sweet spot to in-state tuition and financial aid. And when we're talking about financial aid, we're talking about money to help pay for college or career school. That could be grants, work study, loans, scholarships to help make college or career school more affordable. And then when we're talking about in-state tuition, we're talking about
when we're talking about in-state tuition, we're talking about what are the different policies that are available for students who live here in the state, specifically in California. And it is a policy and requirements that are very essential for the student to be able to meet in order for college to be more affordable versus students who might not be eligible for in-state tuition. And this is one of the areas that can lead to a lot of different roadblocks, specifically for students in high school. Some of you might be encountering students who are just arriving the country who might not be meeting certain eligibility to be able to meet in-state tuition, which is overall the door to give students access to college to make college affordable while also making college accessible by being able to apply for state financial aid here in California. Now, here in California, we've had in-state tuition law since 2001 through AB 540. And this is what the impact of not being eligible for AB 540 looks like for a student. As you can see, when it comes to the community college cost, it's almost 3 times as much compared to someone who is able to meet AB 540 eligibility.
Exactly. So we see here, you know, Sierra College, how much it costs between, it's what Rocio said. You could see the 3 times as much cost between meeting the requirement and not meeting the requirement. And then now we're going to be asking you a question. So give us just your best answer to the following question. And the question is, DACA is required to apply for the California Dream Act. True or false? Okay, we have about 78% of people who voted. Maybe the other ones are I don't knows. We encourage you, I'll give you 10 more seconds just to put in your answer. I can't see who said what, but I invite you to write in what you really think, what you would say. Okay, great. Great. So then I'm gonna go ahead and share the results. So we can see here that about 11% said true, and the other percentage, or sorry, 22% said true and 78% said false of the people that participated in the poll. And the answer to this is false. So DACA is not required to apply for the California Dream Act. DACA is it has to do with people's ability to reside in the United States under work authorization. It's a federal program given by President Obama after a sustained amount of activism from undocumented students. And very important, in our next webinar, we'll be talking about DACA further and in more detail because it's more relevant to people's situation in the United States and their ability to reside ability to reside with a work permit and all of that. So California Dream Act now is it's the laws that allow for undocumented students to be able to qualify for financial aid, to receive money to go to school here in California.
And so given that DACA is not required to apply for the California Dream Act, we're not going to share with you, well, what are the requirements to be able to access state financial aid to the California Dream Act here in California. And it all begins with AB 540/AB 68. So beginning in 2001, there was a law that was passed here in California to be able to give access to students in-state tuition. Like I had mentioned, that is being able to give students the opportunity to be able to afford college. Now, that eligibility was initially being able to attend a school in California for 3 years in high school, obtain their high school diploma. It was then expanded in 2014 to be able to give more students an opportunity to be able to meet AB 540 eligibility. And in 2017, there was an expansion that it added the opportunity for more students to be able to be eligible for AB 540 through the expansion with SB 68. Now, what that means is that students who attend a California high school, adult school, community college for up to 2 years, College Department of Corrections or rehabilitation or any combination of thereof, who complete those 3 years within one of these institutions are able to be considered. It also includes, or it could also be 3 years of high school coursework at one of the following: California elementary, secondary school, or any combination of these. So really being able to have 3 full years or a combination of one of or more of these institutions. And people who graduate from California, obtain a GED, or obtain an associate's degree from a California community college, or are able to meet transfer requirements for a UC or a CSU. Now, these requirements in this eligibility does vary by student. So like we showed you in the diagram, there are a lot of students who might meet different eligibility requirements. When we talked about students who might be traveling outside of the country, it's also important to note that there might be some states that might have different requirements when it comes to in-state tuition and in-state laws. And through some of this work, we have created the California in-state tuition tool. This is a tool that was designed and was created to be able to provide accurate information to students who might not be aware of the in-state tuition laws and policies, and who would like to get an understanding of what is their eligibility in order to receive that quote unquote discount to be able to afford college, which will also open up the opportunity to be able to access state financial aid.
And a couple of things I want to mention, because we got a few questions now that Rocio has been sharing about the eligibility. So one of them was, if a student completed 1 year of high school and 2 years of community college, does that count? And so that could count. We want to now look about did they get an associate's degree, and did they have the high school diploma? And so it could. So I would recommend to fill out the in-state tuition tool to be able to then assess whether the student is eligible or not. That's going to be probably one of the best options.
Yes, that is correct. And even to look into some of the general eligibility is like, what are the options for the student to be able to meet the second part?
Correct. And then also keeping in mind, we are talking about students in California. If somebody is thinking about students nationally or in a different part of the country, that DACA is required in some cases for eligibility for financial aid in different states. So that's why the website that we mentioned earlier, ULead, is so important, because it'll tell you if DACA is required for eligibility, and that would be different in different states. So we have now 2 applications that would be filled by undocumented students who now see, okay, yes, I am eligible for financial aid. Well, there's one application that they would fill here in California, and some people sometimes file FAFSA. So we want to distinguish between the 2 applications. We do have a source on our website that gives this in a lot of detail, and we'll be linking that shortly. And FAFSA is for U.S. citizens, permanent residents, eligible non-citizens, and T visa holders. And as we mentioned, if a student is going to go to a private school or a school outside of California, they might need to file FAFSA in paper form and ask the school to do the count manually. Now, undocumented students here in California would file the California DREAM Act application, have a valid or expired DACA, U visa holders have temporary protective status, or meet the non-resident exemption requirement under AB 540 or SB 68. And that's going to be really, really important for students to know, or for you as educators to know as you work with your students. What kind of aid would these students be qualifying for through the California DREAM Act? Again, if they're eligible for the AB 540 or SB 68. So we have this resource on our website, and you could see that they'd qualify for in-state tuition, not federal aid. And then we see a lot of yeses. When people, submit the California DREAM Act, they're essentially being checked to see if they qualify for all of these grants, aids, loans. There's also state loans, etc.
Which is why it's very important to be able to work with students very closely, and not just with students, but also with families, because through the California DREAM application, there's a lot of information that the student might need to gather from their parents and families. And so one of the things to really point out is that as we're talking and sharing this information, one of the questions that we encourage you to ask yourself is, how can parents be engaged and be informed of these resources for them to be able to outweigh the options for the students to be able to access this type of aid that is available for them through the California DREAM Act. And we're gonna share a little bit more about what are some of the reasons, what are some of the roadblocks that come in the way for students to be able to fully access the aid that they might be eligible for. So some of you, if you are college counselors, you might be familiar with some of these things, and we want to give you all some of the information that oftentimes become roadblock. One is the very first thing is we're always promoting the March 2nd deadline. Oftentimes one of the very first one is the biggest one is if the student does not complete an application by the March 2nd deadline. And again, it's really important that students are not just submitting an application, but they're submitting a complete application by the March 2nd deadline. Some of those other things also include a GPA mismatch. So what that means is oftentimes students, when they're completing a GPA verification form in order to assess whether they're eligible for Call Grants through the California Dream Act, oftentimes there's a mismatch with their information, with the names that they're giving. I know that for me, for example, there could be a lot of many different information or different names that students might share. So there might be a mismatch with the GPA verification form that could lead to an incomplete application.
Yeah. And each of these we'll be addressing shortly in each of the following slides. And so these would be things that you would want to keep in mind as just the top reasons that undocumented students, that the California Dream Act is not awarded. Again, that they don't get the money that they're eligible for. Selective Service is not complete. Income verification process is not complete. The FAFSA instead of the California Dream Act, or the non-resident tuition exemption waiver, known as the affidavit, was missing. And we're going to go through each of these now in more detail to tell you how to resolve for these or how to address them. So for the first question, what is the most common reason that the GPA was uploaded by, the GPA verification form uploaded by a school does not match the student's Dream Act application? And so that's going to be another question, and I have a poll for that. Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. We've had most people already answer. I'm going to share the results with you all. So the student social security number is different. The student has a different legal name, or the student misspelled their name. So I took this from the California Dream Act presentation, one that they did. And the most common reason was actually that students has a different legal name. So for example, my legal name is Estefania Hermosillo Ruiz, and my name that I use at school was always Estefania Hermosillo. I never said Estefania Hermosillo Ruiz. And if someone is an undocumented student, they usually, as an undocumented student, do not have a social security number. So the school is verifying the form through the name and not through the number. And the name, my legal name, is different than what I use at school. So that's the most common. Now the student social security number, if they now have DACA and they have a social security number through DACA, then yes, obviously they have that. There might be an issue there, or the student might have misspelled their name. That could also happen. But be aware that the most common reason is that the student just has a different legal name.
And this is also considering that students don't necessarily need to have a social security number in order to apply for the state financial aid, which is one of the reasons why the name and having a name that matches all of the other documents is very important for students.
Correct. And so one of the things to know, we're going to address, but it's going to be students can check to see that the school sent the correct form, and that's going to, or educators that work with high school students, you can check with the student to see that the school sent the correct form. And now we're going to go into the other situation, which is a selective service. So the selective service is something that every single young male has to apply for. And we have a document on our website where we go into what it is and who needs to register, the risks involved, how to do it, how long it takes, the ways to provide proof, what anybody who's older than 26 should do, and then those who are under 18. So whenever you're working with the student, you would want to have this document out with you and then be reading it with them and then share it with them so that you have this at your fingertips.
And this is also one other thing that also is important to engage the parents with. A lot of the concerns with applying for the selective service is the confusion as to whether undocumented students have to register for the selective service. So again, yes, it is the law for any male who is here in the United States to register for the selective service as soon as they turn 18. Some of the most common concerns also comes from parents and families. So it's very important for you to be knowledgeable more about what the selective service means for young people who aren't documented, to be able to communicate some of those concerns with families as well. If a student does not submit the selective service, does not apply for selective service and does not show proof that they register for the selective service, the student will be getting, will not be able to access the aid that they're eligible for. The way that that looks like at the university level is that they get a hold on their account and they might not even be eligible to register for classes once they begin college. Again, some of those concerns that the student might have might be, what are the risks of me registering for the selective service? So all of this information is also protected through FERPA. So it's very important to be able to inform students regarding some of these, this step that is essential for males once they turn 18.
Yeah, and it takes about 2 to 3 months for students to receive a follow-up and get their verification that they've applied for the selective service. So definitely high school students, high school seniors need to apply ASAP. So as soon as possible, it's going to be when they would want to do this. Then the other thing that was, again, a common situation that would happen with students was that the income verification was not submitted or it wasn't followed through. So we have a document on how to verify your income. This can be scary. This happened to me when I was applying for the California Dream Act. I got selected for verification. First thought was, did I do something wrong? The truth is about 20% of the applications are selected. If an application really does look really off or it doesn't quite seem to add up, then it might be selected for that reason. But 20% are selected anyway. So using this form to assess the next steps for the students to take. And one question that keeps on coming up is, what if the parents do not file taxes? And if the parents do not file taxes, it's going to be important for the counselor to meet with the parents and then to do a cost-benefit analysis of what it takes to, what it could mean and the impact of not filing taxes. So maybe somebody files taxes, like the parents file taxes, and they're going to pay $1,000, but then the student will be, if the parents do file taxes, the student will have, their tuition covered through the California Dream Act. And so a cost-benefit analysis is going to be the best approach. Never saying, yes, you have to do it. It's going to be here and relaying this information to you. And then you as the parents and you as the students have the choice of what to do next. I know that there are concerns for safety. Like, what is the safety? What if it's not safe for these parents to file taxes? One thing that I do, there could be some risk involved in terms of being able to report this information. But it is important to recognize that we're submitting information to the IRS, and while they're an institution it's not connected directly to immigration. And also, in the case of any immigration remedy in the future, taxes are going to be a part of that. Like taxes, if long-term filing taxes works more in your favor than against you, but then again, it could be difficult for people to, that's kind of what I would say about that.
And then what happens when the deadline is approaching and the family has not yet filed taxes and there's this deadline that the student has to meet? So for example, for the California Dream Act for this year's submission, students and families would have to show information from the 2018 taxes, for example. It's pretty much 2 years back. If the family hasn't filed taxes and it's from the 2018, families are able to back pay taxes to be able to have that information. It's important that families do include an estimate, like the most clear estimate in the California Dream application. If they have not yet filed taxes, there's an option for families to be able to write down that they will file. And again, let's remember that a lot of this comes up more for families when it comes to verifying the income. That's when families will have to report and be able to share more detailed information regarding their income.
And then there was another question about who would be the person that would have the conversation on the cost benefit analysis. So it would be the family and the educator, along with the support of a financial aid counselor. That would be the people that would be involved in having this conversation about the cost benefit analysis of filing taxes. And then the other thing that we saw that was a common reason why people did not receive all the financial aid they're eligible for is the student did not filled out the wrong application. So they filled out FAFSA when they were going to be in a school in California and wanted to fill out and were supposed to fill out the California Dream Act. So or they submitted duplicate application. So in order for you to correct this, if they fill out the wrong application, is student needs to then complete the correct application first. So if I filed FAFSA, I now go and need to complete the California Dream Act application and then submit a G55 form, and that is through the California Student Aid Commission, through CSAC. And that would be the best steps and approach to take in that case. And then they do honor, if it was before the March 2nd deadline that they submitted the wrong form, they do honor that and they don't hold it against the student.
And this same applies if a student later down the line legalizes their status. So the student, as soon as a student legalizes their status, which happens sometimes as well, so they might be undocumented, eligible for the California Dream Act, and then later legalize their status and obtain legal permanent residency. It's also recommended to make sure that the student, as soon as they legalize their status, complete the FAFSA application so that they're able to access the federal aid through the federal FAFSA application.
And then the last thing that was, again, common for students is that they did not go through with the non-resident tuition exemption form. If you go on our website, we have all of the forms for the California State Universities, the UCs, the community college. And this is the form that the student needs to file and submit after they've submitted their intent to register into a university. They need to either go to the community college, the UC, or the California State University and complete this form in order for them to then be able to receive the aid. We're essentially saying, I'm going to just do a brief basic answer, which is why we do this. We're essentially saying that the first opportunity we have to become legal residents of legal permanent residents, that we will take that opportunity and do that.
And as a reminder, this form is also known as the AB 540 affidavit. So there might be different names for this form. It's very important to check with the school because different schools also have different deadlines by when they want to have the AB 540 affidavit. There are some schools that require and ask students to have this form by March 2nd. So that can also be another roadblock that students might not be aware of the specific deadline to complete this application. When it comes to students who have parents, when it comes to students who are citizens or legal permanent residents with parents who are undocumented, some of these students might have to complete an AB 540 affidavit given that their residency status is dependent on the parent. So it's also very important to be aware of the specific student needs and eligibility. When it comes to students who are citizens, legal permanent residents, who are eligible for FAFSA and have parents who are undocumented, they are able to complete a FAFSA application. The parents' information is protected, it's safe. Parents have to take on different steps in order to signed the FAFSA application, such as printing the signature page and mailing it out. And again, it is completely safe for parents, families who are undocumented and whose kids are eligible for the FAFSA application.
And so now we're gonna give some time for questions. I know there were a couple of questions that came in that we didn't answer. So based on all of that we just covered, one of the questions that came up was, do many students meet the eligibility for AB 2000? And what are the circumstances? So AB 2000, we did share the file knowing the differences. And in knowing the differences, it goes into detail a little bit more about what AB 2000 is. But AB 2000 passed after AB 540 and before SB 68.
2014.
Why we address SB 68 is because SB 68 encompasses AB 2000, but I'll just answer the question. So AB 2000, a small number of students hurry up and graduate early. So they have the 3 years of credits without the 3 years of attendance, right? Because they have the 3 years of high school credits that are required as part of AB 2000. And, you know, that could have been that they took AP classes, they took summer school, etc. And then they can bring their elementary and middle school to be considered part of their attendance, their 3 years of total attendance, their three years of time. So that's usually who would meet the eligibility for AB 2000. And the other question is, how risky is it for US citizens to file FAFSA if they have undocumented parents? So they can file this application. All educational applications are protected via FERPA. And this is a law that says that the information shared on these applications cannot be shared with a third party. And it would not be shared then with immigration. And so students can, now is it 100%? I can't give like 100% because laws are laws and laws fluctuate. And, you know, the FAFSA application, I haven't heard too much of a case of and it being unsafe for anyone in the many years or from any other educator, because it is through education. Okay, great. Are there any other questions? All right, if undocumented students enrolled in selective service in high school but no longer have their proof, how can they receive it?
This is really
register again.
Yeah, and this is very important message that you have to share with students is make a copy of every document that you send to schools. Never, students should not be sending the original document. Very important that they are making copies. And I think that's another thing that maybe as a high school student, I wouldn't have thought of. Do I actually need to make a copy of this selective form? Because sometimes financial aid offices lose documents. It's happened many times. Very important that the students, and some things might happen that might be out of the control of the student. And the one thing that the student can do is make a copy of those documents. So very important to be able to send that message that for us as adults might be somewhat common for us to maybe make a copy, being able to encourage students to make copies when they're registering for the selective service. And again, if it happens, they'll have to register again.
Great. And then now we're going to go into preparation. And as part of this preparation, we're going to address one of the last questions that came in. So for the last question, I think I'll answer it. If I don't, I'll answer it because I didn't answer it through the slides. But the single most important thing about preparation is submitting the California Dream by March 2nd. At least this is what we have like driven and drilled for people. Make sure to do this. But it's important to know that there are more phases. So applying for the California Dream Act by March 2nd is phase 1 in conjunction with phase 2, which is being able to go on the Cal Grant website to assess that everything has been done correctly. Then it's claiming the aid. During the claiming the financial aid between March and May is usually when the affidavit would be turned in, or a little bit after, and then using the money that you get, which there's not much to use. It mostly goes towards tuition, but using it to pay for tuition.
Yeah, and again, some schools have a very strict deadline as to when they have to submit the AB 540 affidavit. So it does depend by school. It's very important that students know when is the deadline for each specific school to be able to submit the form.
And then the affidavit will require high school transcripts for the students. So, you know, you could put in some of the actions you can take, right? As we've giving you answers to all these questions. Obviously, you can print all of the things that all of the guides, all of the resources we just shared, but you can also have your students all take transcripts with them, like print out a transcript before they leave their high school, or show them how to go get these transcripts. You know, that they know how to do these processes, talk to adults, all that kind of stuff is really just important, right, for them to know. And if they did not graduate, they won't have a diploma, so it must be an official transcript. So it's one of those where it's sealed, and the school seals it, and it's considered official. That's going to be required. I mean, everything we just shared, you could find here in the DREAM Act map. So we see that we have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. So submitting the California DREAM application, again, is just one. If you're still on this webinar and you're from a different state, what you want to notice, and what I say is, while we have, you know, so much legislation implemented, it looks very different. And even for those of us here in California. So, I mean, takeaway, someone asked, like, what can we take away from California? I think the takeaway is that policy is policy, but then in the implementation, there's still a lot of work to do. I mean, it's 2020, we're getting to 2020, and some people still don't know about AB 540 that are high school students, or are afraid to ask about these legislations. So implementation just looks very different, and this map could detail like that there's a lot, right? And you can find just about every question you have on this map. It's on our website. You can print it, and like whenever you get stuck through the process of financial aid, you can go through to one of these squares and you'll find what you need.
And the one thing to also bring up is that how can you share this information with students? One is the financial aid process does not end when students complete the California DREAM application. It does not end there. You can see there's phase 3 and 4, which has additional steps. So how can you let students know the process for applying for state financial aid does not end when you submit your application? These are the additional steps. So very important visual for students to be able to be aware.
And then there's a checklist. We have a checklist of each an item that needs to be covered and taken care of for students. So each of these items is going to be really important that are checked off, and then the student can be sure, or mostly sure, that they've done everything they needed. And there's a question about how do undocumented parents go about filing taxes. There are organizations, nonprofit organizations, that support people with filing taxes. They would need to go to a tax accredited organization and be able to do this. I mean, there's Earn It, Keep It, Save It. It's a free service. Earn It, Keep It, Save It. It's a free service in California that can also do taxes. And remember, people that are undocumented sometimes or usually do taxes with their individual tax identification number, with their I-10. And so if the family is not familiar with that, being able to turn to other resources we also have about I-10. The answer is ITIN, or that, and that's the way that people would file taxes, and it's totally possible to do that. So we have some more questions around the topics we just covered. Do students need to put in their DACA social security number when completing the DREAM Act app?
It is not necessary. It can be recommended. If the student does have a social security number, it's not needed, yes. And if they do have the social security number, this is a number that they get to have for themselves, so they can.
Perfect. And then for students who are in the process of applying for asylum, refugee, have a work permit, but their case has not been finalized, these students apply for the California DREAM Act or FAFSA. And so these students would apply for the, yes. Yes, so if the asylum status has already been granted and approved, they would apply for FAFSA. If it has not been granted and they are residing in the United States as undocumented, then they would be California DREAM Act eligible. Yeah, because they're eligible for AB 540.
Yeah, they will have to assess whether they're eligible for AB 540 and apply for the California DREAM Act if they meet AB 540 eligibility if the application hasn't yet been approved. If their case has been approved, which means they've been granted legal permanent residency, then they're able to complete the FAFSA application. If the student applied for the California DREAM Act while they're in the process of being granted asylum, then as soon as the student it receives their application is approved, then they can immediately submit the FAFSA application so that they can access the federal aid that they might not have been eligible, that they were not eligible for while they were in the process of waiting for their case to be approved.
And then we have someone ask if the student is required to file taxes even if they don't have income. No, if the student does not have income, then they would not be required to file taxes. And then what about students who are in the process of U visa? They have a work permit, but they do not have status.
They apply for the California DREAM Act.
Same if they're eligible for AB 540.
Yeah, so if they're in the process of applying for the U visa, but the U visa hasn't yet been approved, so if they're in the process of applying for the U visa or have been granted the U visa, they apply for the California DREAM Act. Once a person has the U visa and then they apply for legal permanent residency, once they receive their legal permanent residency, then they can go ahead and file for the FAFSA in order to receive aid. But if they are in the process or have received the U visa, they apply for the California DREAM Act up until they obtain their legal permanent residency, which is usually 3 years after being granted the U visa.
And then if a student does not file taxes and gets paid under the table, what do they do when they are verified? So, I mean, if this student is, again, they're a student, which is different than the parent. So the parent's information is required. If the student writes in that they earned all that money through being paid under the table, then they would be assessed for taxes.
Some people who might have said that they are earning money cash and then they get selected for income verification, they could also get a letter or receive a letter from their employer stating or confirming the amount that they've received.
And then now we're going to talk about other scenarios. So what about students that do not qualify for AB 540, DACA, or California DREAM Act, which would be the financial aid? So we're now addressing undocumented students that are not eligible for any of the other things that we had discussed. Really for everybody, but specifically to these students, scholarships is one of the most important aspects, and it's important to look for scholarships. And some scholarships do not require Social Security number and do not require DACA and do not require eligibility for AB 540 or SB 68. For example, the Dream.US, high school graduates may receive up to $29,000 and community college graduates may receive up to $14,500 towards a bachelor's degree at qualifying schools. So keyword qualifying schools, the Dream.US has a partnership with different schools and they could receive some scholarships there. We also have a database of scholarships that the student can go to, Dreamers Roadmap, MALDEF, Scholarship AZ, and these do not necessarily require the AB 540 or SB 68 eligibility. So this at the moment is one of the most important pieces, and that there could be potentially other sources of funding. So sometimes there are fellowships. So fellowships that are designed with everyone in mind may not require DACA and do not require AB 540 or SB 68 eligibility. Independent contracting is another approach. This is not necessarily tied to school. This would be tied to an ability for a person to earn income independent of their immigration status. You could go on our website and look up independent contracting and we'll have a lot of information for you. We're posting right now about scholarships and we'll post about independent contracting. There can also be departmental awards. This is more for grad school, for students that when they start to enter grad school, but they can, or
at the undergraduate degree, depending on the institution and the different departments and the support system that they have. So it's also very important that when students are selecting their schools, it's important to be able to call and ask what are the resources that you have available for undocumented students at your campus. There might be some departments who will offer additional scholarship and funding for students through departmental awards.
And then we're going to discuss all of the different sources of funding for anyone independent of immigration status further in our last webinar. That's going to be the conversation of our last webinar, which is going to take place on April 15th. The other possible is, can citizen children with undocumented parents, what about citizen children with undocumented parents? Can they file FAFSA? Yes. So these students would file FAFSA, and we have an amazing resource on our website that can also answer all the questions that you would have about a citizen student filing FAFSA when they have undocumented parents. And we're gonna post that as well. So any questions regarding what we just discussed? It's for undocumented students from California who will be second year in college next year, and they're attending private out-of-state colleges should they fill out the California DREAM Act application. So for undocumented students from California who will be in their second year in college, and they're attending private out-of-state college, should they fill out the California DREAM Act application? No, that's only if they are going to continue to attend college schools here in California. So they should file the paper FAFSA application and ask that school to do a hand calculations. Whatever private school they're going to.
Yeah, and the one thing is because these institutions are the ones who are going to be determining the aid they're going to be offering the students. So in order for the institution to be able to make a needs-based assessment based on their cost of attendance and the students' financial need, they'll need to have they'll need to have information which is shared to the school by completing a paper FAFSA application.
Yeah, and then the other question that was asked was if the parents live in a different country but the student is in the U.S. with under no guardianship.
There could also be an opportunity for, so one, it's important to assess whether the student is over the age of 25. One, because whether they're dependent of the parents will be dependent on their age. So if they're over the age of 25, they are not dependent of their parents. There are some situations where the student is still dependent on the parent or a guardian that lives here in the United States. For parents who are dependent of their parents and are outside of the country, oftentimes there's an opportunity to be able to share the income of the parent in the country and have that information be transferred over into US dollars.
Correct.
So let's say if the parents are in Mexico, the student is still dependent of their parents, they're here in this country, the parents are earning in pesos, they can input the parents' information and have that information be transferred over into US dollars when they're completing the application.
And then for the California DREAM Act application, they would use the PIN, right? So you could just submit the PIN, and then for the parent signature, they would then use FAFSA. And it's very important that you use our website. So I'm gonna just escape here. Let's see if this, and you go to our website. If you look under resources, we've added a search engine. So you could look at dependent student financial aid purposes, and then look at verifying your income, etc. There's a lot of resources that come up on financial aid, making money, etc. So almost all of your questions, we might or might not have we usually have answers. I mean, we have an amazing expert on the back end. Her name is Nancy Gooditis, who has been working for financial aid for how long have you worked for financial aid? Like 8 to 9 years, and she worked with undocumented students and has developed so many resources that answer the questions that educators have. So now, luckily, we have this search engine, and we encourage you to use it and turn to this to get some of your questions answered as well. We also have a hotline that we're creating for next week. It's going to be on November 26th from 11:30 a.m. to 2 p.m. Hopefully this is sometime between the lunchtime of your students. So if your students have any questions about applying for college, because the applications for CSUs and UCs are due this upcoming November 30th, they can join the Zoom meeting, or they could call in. I'm going to be available, and I'm going to answer whatever questions they have. I'm going to send you this in the follow-up email so that you can share it and share it broadly. And this is, again, because the applications are due November 30th, and we want all the students to apply for college and be sure to know that they can qualify for being able to enter the university of their choice. The next webinar we're going to have is going to be on legal solutions for undocumented students. So we'll address things like DACA. I know that we had a question around if the Supreme Court overrules DACA, how it affects financial aid in California. It doesn't really affect financial aid in California. And we will it's only for works, for work study. Work study would be the biggest thing that would be affected in terms of financial aid. And again, we're going to go further into DACA at the next webinar. And you would get the FAFSA. Another question that came in was where to get the FAFSA form. You would get it at fafsa.ed.gov. All right. And with that, I'm sending you an evaluation. Be on the lookout. I'm sending you also about our hotline, so be on the lookout for that. And thank you so much for joining us. Still we rise, and together we rise together. We rise. We make a difference.
Thank you, everyone.